Hello and welcome back. All right, we're talking about competitive advantage. The discussion around competitive advantage will take a couple of videos. There's several more that will come after this video. The last video, I introduced and then defined the concept of competitive advantage. And what I want to do in this segment of the video series, where we focus on competitive advantage, I want to point out how critical it is in the analytical process and how competitive advantage is really the foundation for creating shareholder value. And then what we'll see is that without a strong competitive advantage, that the value growth is zero. I'm going to separate the idea that investors may value or place value on that growth, but without a sustainable competitive advantage underpinning that growth, the growth will not be realized. It won't create shareholder value. I'm going to flesh all that out. All right, so last video, introduce, define competitive advantage. Now, in this video, I want to start to assess kind of the structure of competitive advantage. And then in subsequent videos, we'll talk about the various sources of competitive advantage, building up the case until we can define sustainable competitive advantage. I will talk, there's a big difference between competitive advantage today and then competitive advantage over time. And the difference is that sustainability of that competitive advantage. All right, let's jump in this lecture. All right, as I talked about in the last video, I set this up that you can think of it, there being kind of four sources of excess return. Excess returns are really the benefit of competitive advantage. Excess returns attract competition. I've talked a lot about that. Keeping competition at bay is the key to a competitive advantage, particularly a sustainable competitive advantage. All right, so there's four primary sources that a company can deliver on excess returns. I'm going to walk through those as we set this up. First is higher prices. This is what we refer to as a demand side competitive advantage. And it's externally facing. It is the interaction with the customers. And it's really the customer's willingness to pay a higher price than you would see in a competitive market. It's the ability to charge more than you would in a competitive company could charge more than they would in a competitive market. And customers happily paying that higher price. But that higher price is also going to attract competition. Those excess returns are going to attract competition. So that's why we refer to this as an externally facing competitive advantage or a demand side competitive advantage. All right. And that's what it looks like. A realized price is higher than what you would see in a competitive market. All right, the second one is what I like to refer to as a supply side competitive advantage, and that's lower costs. Inevitably lower costs than the industry average, lower costs than the competitors. And that's an internally facing competitive advantage. It's a production advantage. In subsequent videos, I'll go into more detail in each of these. I just want to set up the structure for thinking about it. And that, of course, is the supply side or cost advantage shows up in that the company can produce the product, fully loaded costs of producing the product or service, less than the industry average cost curve, or less than what we would see in a competitive market. So the first one was really a demand side, higher price. The second one is this lower costs. And the difference between the two is profitability. Excess profitability leads to higher return on capital. That excess return, it's the excess return that drives shareholder value. Will also show, as I said earlier, will show that the company needs those excess returns, particularly when it comes to growth, to create incremental shareholder value. All right, so those are the first two. Third one is scale, which effectively is a more efficient use of capital. Don't think of capital as only financial capital. In this case, it can be production capital. And we'll show that and go into a fair amount of detail as to what scale looks like. Now, distribution I have listed as a production advantage, but it also can be a scale advantage. So if you have access to distribution, it is a production advantage. If you own the distribution, it is potentially a scale advantage. So it shows up both places. All right, I'm going to use, as we assess competitive advantage, I'm going to use three primary tools in my discussion. One is industry map, and I will thank Michael Porter for his terrific work on thinking about industry structure. Sources of competitive advantage, I'm going to lean on the work of Bruce Greenwald at Columbia. We'll go into detail the work he did. I think by far the best model for thinking about competitive advantage, at least from the outside of a company. And then third is I'll weave throughout the importance of management and company execution as it relates to these competitive advantages. All right, first, Michael Porter. The first thing you want to do is define the relevant industry. And industry is really defined by customers, not CEOs. The CEO of a company may say they're in a certain business, but it's the consumers, customers that really decide what business the company's in. And the simple question is what job are consumers trying to complete? Whether it's a meal, a service, if it's Apple, you want an iPhone or an iPad, a Mac maybe. As you go through the various companies, what job are the consumers trying to complete? And that tells a bit about the competitors, substitutes, and things like that, which Porter talks about. All right, now Chipotle, perfect example. They sell a meal primarily. That's their primary service. So when people go in to buy a meal at Chipotle, they are buying a lunch or dinner mostly. Those are the key operating hours. And Chipotle really is catering to a customer in fast casual more so than fast food. It doesn't mean that customer doesn't buy, shop at Chipotle, dine at Chipotle, and dine at Taco Bell. It's just that consumer generally is more of a fast casual customer, and the substitute would be Panera, Shake Shack, believe it or not, the poke bowls, things like that. Dig in, the salad shops. It's that higher priced, 10 to 12, $10 to $14 individual meal versus a fast food meal. So that's what I mean by customers define markets, not CEOs. All right, so Porter, the next step in Porter is you identify the market participants and determine overall industry structure, often referred to as the Porter industry map. You all have seen this, I'm sure. If you haven't, it's worth reading up on it. But he talks about his 5 forces: threat of new entrants, threat of substitute products, then bargaining power of suppliers, bargaining power of buyers, and then rivalry among existing competitors. I'm going to talk about each of these right now. All right, here's an industry map from a long time ago. I saw it, almost 20 years ago. I'm sorry, almost 30 years ago. I just think it's such a great map, but it's the same thing, just more flowery. All right, so what Porter really talks about, and I think this is the key takeaway, is the battle for profits. Right, that's what's going on. Every company is trying to make more money. Every company is trying to grow. Every company is battling for profits. So if suppliers have power, if your suppliers have power over you, that's going to lead to higher costs, lower profitability. They're going to try to increase their prices because guess what? Even though they're a supplier to you, they're a company and you're their customer. So they're going to try to get more dollars from all their customers. But key is if they're successful, if they have power and they can get higher prices, they're trying to play the same game, that's going to be higher cost for the company you're looking at, which leads to lower profitability. In the same realm, you're a supplier. Effectively, this company that you're looking at is a supplier to either consumers or another company. And if that company, they're trying to do everything they can to lower their manufacturing costs, and consumers are trying to get the best value for the dollar, they're going to try to lean on lower prices. Well, guess what? If they have bargaining power, that's going to lead to lower prices and lower profitability. So you want to think about the suppliers that you have, how powerful are they? And the consumers, how powerful are they? Because both are going to be trying to battle for either higher prices if it's the supplier to the company you're looking at, or lower prices from the buyer's perspective. So that's important. All right, and then you've got the threat of new entrants, and the threat of substitute products. Both are the same thing. They're going after the customer. Whereas the other two, we're looking at kind of price and cost. In this case, it's actually units. Maybe results in price, but you want to think of this as units rather than price or cost. And if the new entrant's successful or the substitute product is successful, then you're going to lose customers, which is lower revenue and inevitably lower profitability. So that's the key. So when Porter talks about this battle for profits, he's really talking about those forces. We'll come back to rivalry, the one in the middle. We'll come back to rivalry later in the lecture series. I don't touch on it today. All right. The third step is you want to ascertain market leaders and assign that economic power that we just talked about. Who has the most power? Now, if the company you're looking at has the most power, then you're in a very good position. If the suppliers have the most power or the buyers have the most power, then the company you're looking at could be at a bit of an economic disadvantage. All right. And then you want to ask yourself, is that balance of power shifting over time? It becomes really important because investing is often about anticipating change, being ahead of that change. So if the balance, you've assessed the balance of power in the industry, now your job is to decide, is that power shifting one way or the other? Maybe shifting towards the company you're looking at, or it could be shifting away from the company you're looking at. Now, here's a chart. It's a couple of years old now, but I thought it was interesting. This is NOPAT, net operating profits, for some big retailers, Walmart, Costco, Target, Best Buy, and Amazon. The black line is Amazon right in the middle, and you could see over time that their economic power through their profitability, overall aggregate profitability, is growing over time, and that's continued. But when you look at this chart, you see that the company has really emerged as an important player, and you could see that Walmart was losing on a relative basis as that competitor emerged. All right, fourth step is you want to look and say, analyze recent or likely changes affecting the industry structure. And one of the things you want to really look at is relative market share over time. In general, the best industries have fairly stable market share. We talked about that in the last lecture. I'll talk more about it later in this lecture series. But the best businesses have stable market share, which is key. So you want to look at relative market share, because if market share is starting to shift in some ways, that's indicative of changes in the industry and potentially changes in the balance of power. So here's an eye chart, although you can always pause the video and take a look. But what I've done is U.S. revenues alone. This is just U.S. retail revenues for Walmart, Sam's Club. I know they're both owned by Walmart, but different format. Costco, Target, Best Buy, and then I added Amazon at the end, which is interesting. I added up all of the annual revenues, so you got a total sales with Amazon for this set of companies, a proxy for retail sales, and then tracked that annually. This I did update through the end of 23, so we've got 11 years here. And then you could look at the growth rate of this proxy, this industry segment, which is kind of interesting to see. You see it really jumped out in 2020 because of COVID. It's been a pretty healthy growth rate. And then what I did, which I think is kind of fun, I'll show you this in charts momentarily, it's really powerful in charts, is I looked at the dollar increase year on year. I looked at the dollar increase for Amazon year on year, and then Amazon's share of the dollar increase in the industry. Pretty amazing, right? So here's the chart. As you can see, it's pretty powerful. You can see that Walmart continues to lose share. Sam's Club's fairly static. Down a little bit, but static in the last couple of years. Costco, flat. Always impressive. Target down, Best Buy down a lot. And then you can see, of course, the big market share shift. So when you put a chart like this together, it's very obvious what's going on. They're going after Walmart. All right. The whole strategy is to go after Walmart. And you see a chart like this, it's incredibly powerful. And then if you go and you take a look at just the increase as a percentage, which is very powerful. This is the percent of their revenue, or their percent of the incremental revenue. So in the most recent year, 55% of the growth in the industry, they got captured. It was just amazing when you could see how much of a shift is. And that's a real shift in the balance of power in the industry. And you could see that things are really changing. Some companies have done okay, and a bunch of companies have not done so great relative to that dislocation in the industry. All right, and then the fifth step is identify any potential disruptions or likely entrants. I think that's really important. Certainly, disruptions happen regularly, although they happen less frequently than people realize, but they're important. Here's five major sources of disruption. And this is a good checklist to be thinking about. When you're looking at a new industry or a new company in an industry, you can stop and say, just go through it. What's the technology landscape look like? What's regulatory landscape look like, particularly when you get a political change, because the new administration will potentially change some of the regulatory environment. Social priorities become really important, as we've seen a lot of that over the last couple of decades. Demographic shifts, as all countries tend to get a bit older over time, and then the political change, which we clearly saw last week. So these are worth looking at, and they definitely happen gradually at first, and then suddenly. So you really have time to assess these disruptions, but keep in mind that they tend to go slower than human time early on, and then all of a sudden accelerate. So you want to keep an eye on them for sure. That's really key. I love this quote. This is from Andy Grove, former CEO of Intel. He said, "Snow melts at the periphery first." I think this is a very powerful insight. When you're looking at these disruptions, go look at the weakest companies in the industry. They will be affected first. They're the canary in the coal mine. If you start to see stress in the edges of the industry, then you really want to pay attention. As that reverberates through the industry, as that diffuses through the industry, it becomes really important. One of my favorite stories is digital photography. People often think of Meta or Microsoft as these amazing businesses. The most amazing business of all time, in my mind, was Kodak. Kodak was absolutely unbelievably dominant for decades in the photography business. And one of the things that was literally brilliant in their pricing strategy is customers paid twice. You would buy the film, you'd go take pictures, you'd come back and pay for the processing. And because they split the transaction, they could charge more. And it'd be fun to go back and look at all the financials, but I suspect the return on capital was spectacular for decades. There's a story that John Eastman, who founded Eastman Kodak, had a anti-competitive lawsuit with the U.S. government. And in the late 20s, he wrote a check out of his own account for the equivalent today of $600 million. I mean, just an amazing business. All right, so in 1976, Kodak sold 90% of the photographic film in the U.S. and had 85% market share for cameras. I mean, that's pretty dominant, right? The year before, an engineer named Steve Sasson invented digital photography. And at the time, given that the Kodak business was so spectacular, I don't think they had any interest in pursuing it. Obviously, today we all use our phones to take pictures. That's the evolution of digital photography 50 years later. I mean, it's pretty amazing. But at the time, Kodak invented this, truly did invent the technology. It's evolved, obviously, dramatically since then, but they were the original source of it. Didn't know much what to do with it. But the company filed for bankruptcy in 2012 because they could never figure out how to morph the business. But the technology had been around for almost 40 years. So that's a perfect example of disruptions happen gradually at first and then all of a sudden suddenly. So keep that in mind, really important. And they always take longer than people believe, but they do accelerate as time goes on. So you can almost always identify them. You just have to be patient as you wait, And what happens is often people lose interest or forget that that's going on, and then it accelerates and it catches people by surprise. All right, so here's the 5 steps to the industry map from Porter. Define the relevant industry, identify the market participants, who are the vendors, important vendors. Obviously, you want to think about suppliers and customers. You want to look at the adjacent markets because you care about entrants and you care about substitute products. You want to see who has the economic power, right? Who are the market leaders who have the key economic power, and then analyze likely future changes affecting the industry structure. That's that shift in the balance of power. You want to look at both disruptions and just shifts in consumer behavior or shifts in the supply side that will affect that balance of power. And then, of course, you want to go through your disruption checklist just to see if there's anything going on. You want those slow moving but potentially very dramatic disruptions. You want to identify those, but you also want to keep track of maybe things that are happening more aggressively right on the forefront. So that's the key. So that's the Porter map. Once we have a good industry map, we can then go assess the individual competitive advantage of the companies we're looking at. We're going to lean on Bruce Greenwald's work in the next segment. And so in the next video, I'll dive into more specific sources of competitive advantage. All right, thank you very much.